Hey, this is Will, and in this lesson, we are going to be talking about setting up the Kubernetes API server. So now that we've installed the necessary binaries, we're ready to go ahead and start configuring our systemd services. And in this lesson, we're going to be creating and configuring a systemd service for the Kube API server, which is part of the overall Kubernetes control plane. And we're going to need to do all these commands on both of our control nodes. So make sure that if you're following along, you do everything on both control nodes and not on just one of them. Now, if you're following along, you may want to check below the video because, of course, as always, you can find the commands that I'm using there if you want to just copy and paste them. So I'm logged into two cloud servers here, and these are my two cloud servers that I'm going to use as my Kubernetes control nodes. So I have my first control node on the left, and the second one is over here on the right. And I'm going to be entering these commands simultaneously to both of these servers. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a directory with an mkdir-p called var/lib/kubernetes. And this is just going to be a directory where we're going to store some important files that Kubernetes is going to need. So I'm going to go ahead and run that command. And now we're going to move the files that we need into that directory. So I'm going to do an ls, and you'll notice I'm in my home directory right now, and I've got these kubeconfig files and these .pem certificate files. And you may remember that we created those files in some of the earlier lessons, and then we actually uploaded them to these servers. So the files that are here are the files that I created earlier when we were generating our certificate authority and generating all our certificates and generating our kube configs. And of course, I also have my encryption config.yaml for my data encryption config. So all these files are still here in my home directory, and now is the time when I'm going to actually start using those files. So I'm going to run this command, and this is just a cp command to copy these files. So I'm copying my CA and my CA key and my Kubernetes key and my Kubernetes certificate, my service account certificates, and my encryption config.yaml. I'm moving all those files to var/lib/kubernetes. And these are all files that need to be in place in order for Kube API server to run. So in preparation for setting up my Kube API server service, I'm moving these files that it needs into the correct location so that Kube API will be able to find all these certificates and configurations. So now that I've moved those files, I'm going to set up some environment variables. And these are not going to be permanent environment variables. They're environment variables that I'm just going to use temporarily in order to generate my systemd unit file. And the first one that I'm going to set up is going to be the internal IP. So internal _IP, and I'm running a command to get the value of what this environment variable is going to be. And I'll actually just echo that variable for you so you can see what that value was set to. And as you can see, it's an IP, and that IP is different for my two servers. It's actually the exact same IP as my private IP over here. Now I could have manually just copied and pasted the private IP for each one of these servers and set this variable on both servers, but I decided to do it this way just because it's a little bit shorter. And all I'm doing is I'm querying the Amazon Web Services API to get the internal IP for my cloud server. So I'm just using a little bit of a trick just to get a reference to that internal IP. But all I need is I need this environment variable to be set to the internal IP on each of these respective cloud servers. Now there's two more variables I'm going to set. I'm going to set controller 0 _ IP, and I'm going to set that equal to the IP from my first cloud server. So I'm going to copy that private IP. Make sure that you use the private IP and not the public IP. I'm going to copy that private IP for the first cloud server, and I'll paste that in. So there is a difference between controller 0 IP and internal IP, because internal IP is different on the left than it is on the right. Each server has a different value for that variable. But controller 0 _ IP, both servers have the same value. And that's because when we set up our systemd unit file, we're going to need a reference to the actual IP of each respective server. And separately from that, we're also going to need a static reference to the IP address of both controllers. So of course, I'm also going to set up a controller1 underscore IP. And as you may guess, I'm going to need to copy the private IP of my second control server over here. So I'm just going to copy that private IP and I'll set that. And again, controller0 and controller1 IP have the same value on both servers, whereas internal IP has a different value for each server. So now that I have set those environment variables, I'm ready to go ahead and generate my systemd unit file. And this is a pretty long command, so feel free to copy and paste this from the description below the video. And as you can see, all I'm doing is I'm just creating this file right here, etc systemd system kube API server.service. So it's just going to be a normal systemd unit file. And of course, this is going to be the contents of that file. And I'm making reference here to those variables that we created earlier. So advertise address is going to be set to the IP of each respective server. So when we run this command and output this file, the file is not going to say $brace internal IP. It's going to have the actual value of that IP right there in the file. And then of course down here for our etcd servers, we have a list of both servers, controller0 and controller1. So I'm going to go ahead and run that command. And we've generated the file. Here in the output, you can actually see how the real values got set for the etcd servers and for my advertise address. So that's the systemd unit file. There's one other flag I want to draw your attention to, because if you're familiar with the original Kubernetes the hard way guide on GitHub that was made by Kelsey Hightower, there's one small difference that I added to this unit file in order to accommodate the environment that we're using here on our cloud servers. And that's this flag right here, the kubelet preferred address types. And you don't need to know really all the details of what that's doing, but I wanted to draw attention to it just so that you'd be aware of the differences in case you are interested in following along with the original GitHub guide, or you just want to understand how this relates to that. This is setting an order of priority that determines how the kubelets report their internal IP addresses, and we're giving precedence to internal IP. And if we don't do that by default, the kubelets will report an IP address that ultimately will not be usable in certain situations, and certain functionality within Kubernetes will not work. It will work overall, but we won't be able to do things like execute commands in containers or get logs from containers. Things like that will break without this flag within our particular environmental setup. So we've added that flag just to make sure that all those things work. Now we have generated our systemd unit file. We are not going to start up the Kube API server service just yet. In the next couple lessons, we're going to configure the rest of the services that we need to set up, and then we'll start them all up at the same time. So for now, we've done all that we need to do for this lesson to go ahead and configure our Kube API server service.